what I want to talk about in the about 15 minutes before we go to Q&A is I want to talk not so much about the data mining, but I want to talk about the data. Because what happened in the last decade or so is that the amount of data has roughly doubled every 1.5 years. To be precise, this year alone, more data will be created and shared by people than from the beginning of mankind till the end of last year. This year, more data will be created and shared by people than from the beginning of mankind until the end of last year. That is pretty amazing. Now, I want to focus on social data. You said in the introduction, social media. I'm not talking about social media. I just want to make the contrast. Social media typically is PR departments that try to push the same old tired messages through yet other channels like Twitter and Facebook. So social media tends to be a one-directional broadcast. What I'm interested in the context of privacy is social data. And for me, social data has two meanings. One, social as in the social graph, meaning who is related to whom. That could be who makes phone calls to whom, who returns phone calls by whom. Or it can be who is friends with whom on Facebook. So that is one meaning of social data. The other meaning of social data is social as in sharing. As I might be sharing photos, or I might be sharing, in this case here, my location, my geolocation. So we are talking about specifically social data, and I focus on the creation and the sharing of it. I don't focus on where the bottleneck lies right now, which is the consumption of those data. How do we build products that allow us to consume this data beyond the simple graph I just showed you? What percentage of my time is spent at home, in the office, and out? Why is this happening now? Because of two things. One, the cost of creating data has essentially disappeared. Specifically, the cost of automatically sensing data has disappeared. There, for instance, this company called Color, which just came out with a Facebook app. And it takes the sound of my microphone and my mobile phone, the location, the light, the motion of my mobile phone, just to figure out whether the picture I took was taken in the same room at the same time as a picture somebody else took. I'm going to give a talk at the General Assembly of the United Nations in a couple of weeks. Data is the new oil. And the examples there will range from how in South Africa the post office decides where to build new delivery stations based on where do people actually go based on their mobile phone patterns. Another example is traffic data. We don't need to model traffic anymore. We can just look at how, with what speed, do mobile phones move. So that is just one example how mobiles can help governments, agencies, post offices, and also individuals make better decisions. So that was one, that the cost of sensing has disappeared, and it is focused on mobile phones. The other driver of this change is that the cost of communication has disappeared. Arab Spring is one example. Dating apps is another example. I'm on the board of a company called Scout, S-K-O-U-T, which is a mobile dating app which tells you exactly how many meters you're away from that person you might be interested in. when you look at the combination of cost of sensing having disappeared and the cost of communication having disappeared, then you realize that we now live in a world where actually the amount of data we can use to learn about people, to give them insights, is of course unprecedented to what it has ever been before. So I want to give you 3 examples. The first example I showed you with latitude. The second example is facebook.com/phonebook. So what Facebook does, it takes my mobile phone data, the phone numbers of my friends who are in my BlackBerry, and looks up who are those people, and then suggests to me that, hey, you have this person's number, why don't you become friends with them? And that is interesting. Bridging back to the dating example, somebody might not have given you their name. You might have just exchanged their mobile phone number. And now, suddenly, their name, pictures, and whatever their public view is revealed, and you might as well go beyond the initial date and befriend them on Facebook. The third example I want to give are photos. Estimates say that it's about 3.5 trillion photos have been taken throughout history. And out of those, about 4% are hosted on Facebook. Facebook hosts about 140 billion photos. So that is about, if we assume, I'm a physicist, 10 billion people on Earth, then that is about 10 photos to 20 photos per person on Earth. Now, as you might know, face recognition is getting increasingly better. So by now, the fact that you and somebody else were in the same location at some point in time might, on the one hand, suffice as an alibi for you that you were not somewhere else where the crime was committed. But on the other hand, if the face recognition isn't perfect, you precisely might be recognized as somebody who was at a location where he better shouldn't have been at a time when something bad happened. So the key question for me is, how actually do we deal with wrong data about us? I think that is one of the key questions which we have to grapple with. Not an easy one, because whatever answer you are coming up with, I can tell you that, that person who might not have the best intentions, of course, will go back and pretend that he wasn't there either. I would like to close my opening remarks here by reframing the privacy discussion as an identity discussion. Now, what is a pimp? A pimp is somebody who sells the time of others, or sells others. What's a prostitute? A prostitute is a person who sells their own time. We could argue that we all fall into one of those, or maybe even both categories. Now, I've heard that in Vegas, the most important control mechanism in the underworld was the mobile phone numbers, almost specifically the SIM cards of people. Pimps, prostitutes, drug dealers, all used disposable cell phones. So when they needed identity, they could have it. When they didn't need it, they discarded it. I just learned at this weekend in Greece that apparently, and I don't know whether it's true, maybe some of you know, that when you enter US immigration, and as I said, I don't know whether it's true, that as you put your passport down at the beginning of the line, they also have a little sensor there which tries to sniff your phone number. So now that means that the government can relate your mobility patterns, or rather your phone's mobility patterns, with your identity, namely the passport used when you immigrated. Interesting. So for me, the war which we are going to see in the next years is the war about identity. My passport or my passports are very weak identities about myself. Just some picture, some piece of paper. With an ID number in the German case, where actually when I get a new passport, I get a new identity number, unlike the US Social Security number. Much more powerful than that static piece of a passport for identity is, of course, the relationships I have with others. So when you, for instance, lose your Facebook password, Facebook just asks a couple of questions which are related to the relationships you have with others, like, where were you with that person? And if you say, yes, it of course was in Shanghai when we had a party at my place. And a couple of questions like this, they know it's much more likely you than that you can get these answers by mistake. What I see is that bridging the physical and the digital, being in the same photo at the same time, or having physical faces recognized in the digital world, is where these wars will be happening. Whether it will be Google Plus or Facebook, I can't think of other contenders right now, only time will tell. The last remark, I've done some work with Thomson Reuters, specifically with Westlaw, where kind of public records, court records, were, over the last 100 years, digitized. So people, lawyers like you, can access those. So it's not a black and white, what is private and what is public. We will see data mining show up in order to create value for people, because with this plethora of data here which is being created, those companies that make the consumption better, that make the consumption consumable, if you will, I think, be the ones who people are going to pay money to. So I think after these remarks, I have more to say, but I'm watching the time here. I would like to see whether there are any questions which I could answer or maybe can't answer, but I would like to turn it over to you. And maybe you can turn the video on so I can be good.
I think that is excellent. This is Professor Whitty again. I suggest that maybe each of us on the panel ask you a question and then open it up to some of the participants here. Be aware that I think that the problem we had with your audio seems to be related to our mic being on. So after we ask the question, I'm going to turn it off, and we don't hear feedback, that's why. But my first question to you relates to your reframing of the issue of identity versus privacy. And the American Federal Trade Commission did a report on this area as to the sort of tension between privacy rights and the massive collecting and sharing of data. And they suggested that American citizens should have a right to sort of their identity report, like their credit report, which then they can correct mistakes on and sort of resubmit. Is that a realistic aim? Could that be part of the solution to some of these tensions?
Okay, so the question is whether we should be able to correct our identity or mistakes in our identity. I think much more powerful than me correcting mistakes in my identity is to have my social graph empowered to correct mistakes in my identity. Here's what I mean by that. If I'm a criminal, I have no problem correcting things in the wrong direction. But any of my undergrads at Stanford can write a script which will identify people whose social graph just looks very different. So people like Reid Hoffman, and there is a YouTube video out where we discussed that issue. Reid was the founder of LinkedIn. And now we discussed whether by socializing things about yourself, like where you have worked, whether we get more honest responses, more honest statements about where people work and what they did, because they know that not only the company they're sending their resume to, but basically their friends will see this, and they don't want to be caught lying to their friends by upgrading their position as a junior developer to CTO of a startup which folded 5 years ago. So I think what we see is the social norms, the social pressure correcting the data more than people doing the work themselves. Let me reframe this and say this differently. Last year, the city of San Francisco invited Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, and me to speak about their open data project. And we made very strong points for what we called liberating the data the city had, precisely because you have interested parties looking at the data and correcting them if they're wrong, as opposed to some city clerk, who got the comma wrong, looking for the decimal point wrong, looking through it again and trying to fix it.
I think I understand what you're saying is, even if we had the power to fix it, we're not as reliable as what we do. And if what we do can really be tracked, it's going to be the most accurate portrayal of who we are.
Actually, I made a different point. The point I made was that if we have our social graph, the people who we are connected with see our data and have them corrected, then we end up with a clearer view of who we are than if only we ourselves have access to the data.
So like a peer-reviewed identity?
Yes, which we de facto have on Facebook. That if I say something incorrect about myself, there will be people who comment on that. A paradigm is now also used in data analysis. So it's a new form of collaboration which is happening, including collaboration about facts about people. And people have to make the decision whether they want to have cleaner data, which means that they have to socialize this data, or whether they want them locked up, which means that they cannot leverage the crowds, the wisdom of the crowd, or at least the little bit of attention which people have. Think about Wikipedia, where people just fix things as they go along.
Very cool. I'm going to hand this over to Professor Clifton, who hopefully has a question.
And by the way, I still don't have your video. Can I have your video? I feel a bit disconnected here if I only have the audio.
Okay. We'll try to turn it on, but when we did, it told us it was going to affect call quality. So we'll...
Let's see how it works. Yeah, I can hear you well. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question for you. One option is correct the data, but in some cases, we may not even know where the data is wrong or what's wrong about it, or the person who's using it, we may not even know that it's out there. Is part of the problem actually that the data is being misrepresented? Like, for example, the location example you showed from Google, where they said home, work, and abroad, where they really should have said SAP, some address, and other, which would have been correct information, and then someone could have said, well, oh, he's not spending time at work because I know SAP isn't where he is.
What was the question?
Instead of trying to correct the data, should we be trying to correct the way the data is being represented, the outcome of that?
So I think it's actually not about the data. It's about what people do with the data. So ultimately, and I would like to invite you to this Gedanken experiment, to that thought experiment, who cares whether data about you is correct or not if nobody acts on it? So I think that's one important distinction here, and lawyers have this, and I'm not a lawyer, so I actually don't know much about it, but really the acting upon something versus just, knowing something. Tim O'Reilly, who just ran the conference or talked to yesterday in New York, he has this wonderful example that he says he has actually windows in his house. Somebody can look in. Somebody can look in, 4 hours a day. But it's not really that somebody could potentially look in, just like, of course, the parallel is that somebody can observe my geolocation. But what would they do about it? So I think another example was given to me by the former chief scientist of British Telecom, who said when people stay over at his place, he of course doesn't mind if they use a shampoo. But it would be highly unusual if he caught them raffling through all of his drawers, checking out what he has in the back of his drawers. So people could do that, of course. They could wait until he's out of the house, maybe using geolocation with Google Attitude to check whether he's really away. But people don't. So it's about what do you do with data as opposed to what could you do with data.
This is Professor Woody again. I think that's an excellent point, frankly, and that's sort of the culture clash between where you're coming from and sort of the legal mind is always assuming the worst of people. And we're cynics. And so we almost skip over the premise that if you can do it, you're going to abuse it and use it to hurt me. And we're not always open to, well, there are good people and good companies, and there are good reasons to use this and bad. Our knee-jerk reaction, and I think part of what we're trying to talk about today is, if you can abuse it, then let's stop it. And what are the dangers there, maybe?
Right. I gave a talk at Adobe about a month ago where I said, design your product for your users and not for your lawyers. And the example I gave was GM has something called OnStar, which is geolocation of the car. And basically, their lawyers chopped out every singly possibly useful feature. Because somebody, they figured out, could use it to prove that, their husband was, sleeping over at some other place as opposed to staying in the office all night long. So I think, let me give you one more example. In the German parliament last week, in this mobility discussion, somebody from Deutsche Bahn said, we can't give access to our timetable data. I said, what are you talking about? Don't you want people to know when your trains are leaving? And they said, no, somebody might be building an app that actually gives them wrong connections. And I said, well, don't we know actually very quickly by star ratings in the App Store that if some app gives you bad connections, people won't use that app? Why do you think that what you can build internally is anywhere near as good as what, out of 1,000 little apps, one of them would be able to build? And the rest of the companies will just, die, or this app just won't get sold, and people will build the next one. So liberating data, letting other build stuff on that is the point I'm trying to make.
Professor DeVoe has a question for you.
Hello, Andreas. It's Dick DeVoe.
Hey.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Is your video on?
My video is on. Yes.
Can you see us?
I see the audience, yeah, but the camera is. Yes. Hey. Okay.
So, I've been exiled in Western Massachusetts for a while, and I'm not out in Palo Alto like you are, but I was at a conference recently, and I was listening to some of the statisticians at Facebook, and I was amazed at just the sort of sociological data analysis that they're doing. And I guess you can find it at facebook.com/data, but I'm just wondering if you have any fun stories about the kinds of things that they're looking at, because I was amazed they're doing anything like that.
Yes. Former student of mine, Eric Sun, did a couple of very interesting pieces of analysis. One was trying to find influencers, people who propagate messages, people whose messages get propagated, and basically came to the conclusion it's less about the person than it is about the message, which is very interesting. So Facebook essentially is a distribution platform, a social distribution platform. And the debate was, is it that because person X writes something, I'm going to comment on it or distribute it or forward to my friends, or is it because subject A is being talked about? And it turned out that it's more really about the subject than about the person. Bad news for all those marketers who make all their money by pretending that they have the influences in certain fields, and if company Y only gives them enough money, they will get the product to the influencers, then magically it will spread to the rest of the world. Another example is going back to geolocation, that Facebook, by location and knowing who you're connected to, knows much better where you are than anybody knows by IP address. There's lots of interesting examples here. The question is really, what do you do with these insights? So it's clear that people share incredible amounts of data. On average, I think people, there's a billion pictures posted a day on Facebook, something like that. But why do people do it? And I think what we have seen is that if people can share in order to get attention, they will. So I think the ultimate driver for people doing stuff on Facebook is to get attention. And all of the data analysis on Facebook actually pushes in the direction so people can get more attention.
Well, Andrea, this is Jason Shen, the attorney on the panel. And you've convinced me that data needs to be liberated. I'm going to advise all my clients to turn over the keys to the kingdom and let data be free. But my question is, if somebody wants to participate in today's world, is there any meaningful way to sort of opt out of this data collection or to limit that collection, aside from just going completely off the grid?
I think these are precisely the two options. You can be Unabomber who gets off the grid, or you participate. I think that we as society have to, in my case, try to influence social norms, try to influence company culture. So it is going the right direction. You as lawyers have to influence legislation. So things hopefully go in the right direction. But it is very interesting. I saw the statistics and I actually couldn't find it in preparation for my few minutes here, that my age group, I think the 50 plus, share actually way more geolocation data than the 18 to 25-year-old. It just came out last week. So many of the things that people say about teenagers or people in the student age are just simply not true. People are way more aware than we ever think about that anything they ever say will be there forever. There's a blog post a couple of students did in my class last quarter. It's on weigend.com/blog, where people say that they're much more careful in the online world than they are in the physical world in saying critical things, because they know that that employer will be able, that potential employer will be able to find it. And I actually played with this. For instance, here, my t-shirt. I gave each student in the class a t-shirt, which has a unique QR code. So they thought it was just a homework where they wrote some program. But I wanted to show to them that actually what it was about is that I can track them by people taking pictures of their t-shirt. Or at least I can track the t-shirt. So I think you need to drive this to the students today, that pretty much everything is there forever. Like the fact that I was at JetBlue headquarters yesterday.
Well, you got a big laugh from the t-shirt thing, and I had you on mute, just so you know. I don't want to cut into anyone else's time, but I think maybe one question from some of the audience.
Tell me where I'm totally wrong. Where do you think I'm just so totally off that I have no idea?
Matt, all right.
I guess my question kind of goes along with the analogy you drew. If for all intents and purposes, my question is about John. Sorry, that's the customer still the one for the streets like me. My question is, the usage of data mining, it seems to be really a big business ploy. And so my question is, not as much the implications on us as consumers being mined, but rather on the impact of using data mining in business planning. Do you think it's something that's going to really drive down the markets for businesses that rely on data mining, like Facebook or advertising, internet, things like that? Is it going to really narrow the market down for small businesses and small companies that have problems starting up as data mining becomes more and more of a crutch in which big businesses need?
Okay. I think that by the identified, whoever the identity provider will be the key thing. By them opening up data, as Facebook is pushing as well as Google is, in selective ways, of course, so they keep their power. As them opening up, a whole ecosystem of companies will start flourishing for all kinds of things. There's this quantified self-movement where people learn about themselves much more than you learn in your annual visit to your doctor, for instance. So I think for the identity, which I think is the key question, there will be, I think, very, very few winners. For the ecosystem built on top of that, just think about like Apple with the App Store and Android App Store, there being a couple of winners, but then an ecosystem of probably millions of apps which were not able to live without the underlying platform of the Android or the Apple operating system. And then ultimately, I'm very naive here. I think it's about the value it provides, the value it provides to the end user. So if it helps people make better decisions, then I think people will use it. If it doesn't help, if it's just advertising, which people don't build decisions on, it won't help them. So back to your initial question. I think the future of work is just simple, better matching between people. And so if the prostitute knows, what that John really wants, and if that John knows what the prostitute really provides, hey, if it's a better match, I think everyone is better off. Wouldn't you agree?
I can't, yeah, absolutely. Applause. I can't think of a better way to cut you off. And I just want you to know, Andreas, we have all enjoyed listening to you. I think we could all night. I understand why you've been described as a visionary. You're charging up my imagination. And one thing I'm thinking here is, I teach contracts, and contracts in the U.S. are based on the free market theory. And there's a lot of what you're talking about that sounds vaguely familiar. The free market of data and the free market theory have a lot in common. And one thing they both have in common, too, is it requires everyone operating in the marketplace to proceed in good faith. And when that works, everyone's richer. And so I applaud your naivete, and maybe it's better framed as goodness, and I hope we can all share that as the data revolution continues. Just so you know,